Welcome to Am I Famous Yet? Memoir of a Working Class Rock Star. This is chapter 19 called You're Fired. For every resounding success in anyone's career, there are even more failures. Most failures are small things like not getting called for a particular Saturday night gig during the summer busy season. That happens. More often, you just don't get called back for a gig that you once had. There are no reasons given. There may be no specific reason other than the dude's cousin also plays bass and lives closer to the gig. It's not always something that's someone's fault. But there are other failures which feel colossal. These are the ones that make me question every choice I've ever made in my life, not just my career decisions. They can feel like a gut punch. Often, too, these epic flameouts aren't necessarily anyone's fault. Things just happen. Very often, circumstances beyond anyone's control, but that doesn't make it feel any better. Sometimes you get a dream gig. You're sitting on top of the world, feeling invincible, and still you get fired. I've often said that I've been the guy who's been fired, and I've been the guy who's been hired to replace the guy who's been fired almost equally often. It's the nature of the music business in a way. Things change, band personnel changes, artistic trends change, budgets change, that's a big one, and people get fired. What follows are accounts of some of my more memorable terminations. One of the earlier ones was at a pub gig when I lived in England. I was playing with a bar band called the Dublin Cowboys, who found my classified ad in the music paper. They rang me up and said, "The gig pays £27.50 a man, no rehearsal, be at the Consumptive Friar pub at 8:30. It was a fun band that did classic rock covers by the seat of their pants. The chord changes were pretty simple, often intuitive, and always easily discernible by looking at the guitar player's left index finger. They played a lot of salt-of-the-earth working man's pubs and some pretty colorful council estates all over London. We got hired to play a birthday party one Saturday lunchtime at a pub in South London. We set up and played our first song. The party host came over to us and said, "It's a bit loud. Turn down, please." We turned our amps down. We played a second song. The host came over and said again, "Still really too loud. Please make it lower." We turned our amps down again. We played a third song. The host came over and said, "Here's your money. You're done. Go home." We were fired and paid not to play. Much later in my career, I was called by a producer friend of mine to play some arco, as in bowed, upright bass, on a music track by comedian Stephen Wright. He was doing a songwriter album, not comedy, apparently. I told the producer quite honestly that arco playing was the least spectacular of all of my parlor tricks. He assured me that it would be fine. All he needed was some footballs. He meant long tones because written whole notes kind of look like footballs on the musical staff. I turned up to the session with my upright and my bow in hand. He started playing me the track. I started trying to drone along with it. About 20 minutes into it, the producer says, "This really isn't flowing. Let's just call it a day. I'll pay you for your time." I felt really embarrassed and inadequate, even though I had told him that I'm not great with the bow. I also refused his money. I wasn't going to make him pay me for that abomination, even if it did take me most of the afternoon to transport my upright bass to the studio on the train. It wasn't his fault I sucked. A couple of years after that, I began to woodshed my arco playing very heavily in order to be able to sub in the pit of a short-lived Broadway show called Amazing Grace. That score was 95% arco. It required me, a rock and soul electric bass player with no classical training, to suddenly practice 3 hours a day just to try to be adequate with the bow. I ended up playing that show 6 times before it closed. I just barely got away with it, I think. I also learned an important lesson at that recording session. The so-called easy footballs that the producer had called upon me to play are some of the most difficult things to actually execute cleanly on a recording. Faster moving passages with lots of notes are easier to play than long tones. There was another high-level theater experience which shall remain nameless. I will neither confirm nor deny whether this was actually on or off of the Broadway. When I started subbing on this particular show, the music director told me that my approach was a little more aggressive than the guy I was subbing for, but that he liked it. Cool, I thought. I'll keep playing the show that way. The boss likes it. Skip ahead a year. I had played the show about once a month and successfully done about 14 performances. Suddenly, I had one particular show that wasn't so great. The guy I was subbing for called me about 2 hours before curtain time, saying that he was sick and asking him if I would do him a solid and fill in last minute. Ordinarily, I would have liked to review the score at least once at home before I went in, just to make sure that it was fluidly under my hands. I also preferred to read the show off of my own copy of the book in my own binder. This allowed me to practice my own page turns throughout the show as well. Neither of these conditions were met that day. I went in to play without being able to review the show, and I hadn't played the book in several weeks when he called me. Also, I was out and about and unable to get home to get my binder before going to the theater in order to make the curtain time. I would be forced to read off his score that night with all the different page turns that I had not practiced. My stress level was high, but I knew I would be all right if I just stayed focused, leaned forward a bit, and dug into the book. I made it through the show without any major mistakes and felt proud of myself for rising to the challenge. But then I was fired. Actually, I wasn't fired. They told the guy I was subbing for that he could use me, but it had to be a lot less often. It took a couple of years for me to realize that a lot less often had actually turned into never again. I had a couple of emails with the music director and with the player I was subbing for. What I think happened was this. Over the course of a year, the music director went from very gradually from liking my more aggressive playing to not liking it. Yet he never told me this until he decided that he was fed up with me. Meanwhile, I had been consciously digging in when I subbed over there because he had told me that initially he had liked it. It was basically a miscommunication that never got solved in time to keep me on the sub roster of that show, unfortunately. Also unfortunate was the fact that this one non-official firing shook my confidence quite a bit. Suddenly other gigs that I knew like the back of my hand felt shaky and alien to me. I began seriously questioning my abilities to play bass in public at all. It was a tough time for me for a few months. I gradually talked myself down off the bridge and recaptured the confidence that I felt I had earned after decades of playing professionally. But it took a minute.